It all started when my family moved into the quiet little neighborhood we'd dreamed of for years. It wasn't anything fancy, a small house with a patchy lawn and a creaky gate, but it was ours. My parents, immigrants who worked hard to build a better life for us, were so proud the day we finally unpacked the last box. At first, it seemed like the neighborhood was warm and welcoming. A few people smiled as we moved in, and a kind old man from across the street even brought over a pie. But then, we met her sister, Mrs. Carson. She lived next door, always peeking out from behind her curtains or sitting on her porch with a scowl etched into her face. She didn't say much at first, but her cold stares were enough to make me uneasy. I could tell she didn't want us there. The first time it escalated was a week after we moved in. My little sister was drawing chalk art on the driveway. Nothing fancy, just flowers and rainbows. Mrs. Carson stormed out, yelling that we were ruining the neighborhood. She called my sister's drawing trash and told my parents to keep their kids under control. My mom apologized, even though we hadn't done anything wrong. She always tried to keep the peace, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. After that, it felt like Mrs. Carson was always watching us. If we played music in the house, she'd bang on the wall. If we watered our lawn, she'd accuse us of wasting water. Once, she even called the police, claiming our dog was dangerous. He was a tiny, friendly dachshund who wouldn't hurt a fly, but the officers still came to our door. "She's just trying to scare us," my dad said after they left. "Don't let her get to you." But it was hard not to. Every day, there was something new. She'd make loud, hateful comments about immigrants when we walked by her house. Once, she shouted at my mom in the grocery store, calling her lazy and a burden. My mom kept her head down, but I could see her hands shaking as she pushed the cart away. It wasn't fair. My parents worked harder than anyone I knew, and yet, to Mrs. Carson, we were just those people. The worst part was how helpless we felt. My parents didn't want to fight back, they just wanted to live peacefully. "She's not worth it," my dad would say, but it was exhausting. Then something changed. One morning we noticed a "for sale" sign on Mrs. Carson's lawn. She had been renting her house, and apparently, the owner had decided to sell it. My dad said it was probably just a coincidence, but I couldn't help but feel a little hope. Maybe, just maybe, we'd get some relief. A month later, moving trucks pulled up. Mrs. Carson was furious, yelling at the movers as they loaded up her belongings. She glared at us one last time before slamming her car door and driving away. I felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. The new owners arrived a few days later. They were a young couple, bright and cheerful, with a toddler who loved to chase butterflies in their yard. From the moment they moved in, they made an effort to get to know us. They waved every time they saw us, and even brought over cookies to introduce themselves. One evening, as we stood chatting over the fence, the husband mentioned something that stopped me in my tracks. "I heard from the landlord about the last tenant," he said. "Sounds like she was causing a lot of trouble. He said he had to kick her out because she was harassing the neighbors. That wouldn't happen to be you, would it?" My dad hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, she wasn't very kind to us." The man frowned. "I'm so sorry you went through that. People like her don't belong in a neighborhood like this." Hearing those words felt like validation. For the first time, someone acknowledged what we'd been through. It wasn't just in our heads, it had been real, and it wasn't okay. Life has been peaceful since Mrs. Carson left. The new neighbors often stop by to chat, and the neighborhood feels warm again. My little sister can draw her chalk art in the driveway without fear. My mom smiles more, and my dad jokes about finally winning the lawn war now that no one's accusing him of overwatering. Looking back, I realized something important. Mrs. Carson's hatred didn't define us, and it didn't win. Our family stayed strong, supported one another, and held on to kindness even when it wasn't shown to us. In the end, that's what matters. It feels good to know that our home, our little corner of the world, can finally be a place of peace and happiness. And as for Mrs. Carson, wherever she is, I hope she finds a way to let go of her anger. Life's too short for hate. Months went by, and the change in the air was palpable. Without Mrs. Carson's constant negativity, the neighborhood felt lighter. The young couple next door, Ryan and Priya, quickly became more than just neighbors. They became friends. They'd invite us over for barbecue evenings, and Priya would often drop by with baked goods saying, "I made too much, and I thought you'd enjoy some." For the first time since we moved in, my parents began to relax. My dad planted flowers in the front yard, something he had avoided before because Mrs. Carson had called his gardening pointless. My mom started sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, waving at neighbors as they passed by. Even I noticed a shift in myself. I no longer dreaded coming home, worried about what petty thing Mrs. Carson would do next. One day, as I was helping Ryan fix his fence, he brought up something that stayed with me. "You know," he said, hammering a nail, "I've been thinking about what happened with Mrs. Carson. Some people carry so much hate inside them that they forget how to see the good in others. It's sad, really." I nodded, but something in his words struck a chord. I realized that Mrs. Carson's actions had never really been about us. Her bitterness and anger were a reflection of her own unhappiness. It didn't make what she did right, but it gave me a strange sense of closure. She hadn't won. We were still here, thriving despite her efforts to make us feel unwelcome. A few weeks later, there was a block party. Ryan and Priya had helped organize it, inviting all the neighbors to come together for food and music. My mom cooked a big pot of her famous biryani, and my dad grilled kebabs. As we mingled with our neighbors, laughter and chatter filling the air, I couldn't help but think about how far we'd come. During the party, the old man from across the street, the one who had welcomed us with a pie, raised his glass. "To the best neighbors a person could ask for," he said, looking at us. "This street's a better place with your family here." His words brought tears to my mom's eyes. She wiped them away quickly, but I could see how much it meant to her. All those moments of hurt and humiliation felt like distant memories now, replaced by the warmth of acceptance and community. As the evening wound down, I caught my little sister drawing chalk art on the sidewalk again. This time, she wasn't alone. Ryan and Priya's toddler sat beside her, giggling as he tried to copy her drawings. The sight made my heart swell. Life wasn't perfect, it never is, but it felt whole, and that was enough. Sometimes I still think about Mrs. Carson. I wonder where she ended up and if she ever found peace within herself. But more than that, I think about the lessons her actions taught us. We learned to stay strong in the face of adversity, to hold on to kindness even when it's not returned, and to never let hate diminish the love we share as a family. In the end, it wasn't Mrs. Carson who defined our time in this neighborhood. It was the good people who showed us that love and acceptance will always outweigh ignorance and hate. And for that, I'll always be grateful.